Okay, we are officially live. Yes, the clock tells me we're officially live, and we're 9 seconds into this, the final three, as it were, the final three of the ImpEx 3D series or Distillery Deep Dive series. Most of the previous events did just that. It focused on distilleries, and we did some deep dives, and then the last one that we did was with Ollie Chilton, and he was wearing the hat of the master blender for Port Ascaig, and we got to learn all about the ins and outs of his blending practices and really just the ins and outs of constructing a brand and keeping a brand going. And of course, again, that was Port Ascaig, and I'm incredibly excited to bring the good Ollie Chilton back today. And this time while Port Ascaig is an independently bottled Islay single malt Scotch whiskey, they're bottlings that include many different casks to create a batch. And today what we'll be discussing is the Single Malts of Scotland brand or label, which, if memory serves, and Ollie can surely correct me if I'm wrong here, but if memory serves, was the Whiskey Exchange's first label. I could be wrong. Let me bring Ollie in just now, and then he can correct me. Hey, Ollie.
Good morning. How are we doing?
Good evening, morning to you. I'm well. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. 3 drams in, very happy.
All right. 3 in already. Oh, I'm 3 sips in.
Well, I started my day a lot longer ago than you.
And did you? I didn't ask you this. Did you? Last time you took a nap before this?
No, I didn't. Last time I thought I would, and then I didn't. And this time I definitely didn't. I thought, okay, I'm just going to stay up because I felt so good by the end of the last one. So I figured that's going to happen again. I was quite happy to talk for another hour, which no one else needed. So
I needed it. So people are starting to sign on. They're saying hello everybody. Oh, Aaron, I've got to just pop this up here. Aaron started with a really good whiskey. So
Nervous 96.
Yeah, so I want to talk about some of the bottlings that we've brought into the States so far, but I don't want to get there yet. First, what I'm hoping people will do is put some whiskey in their glass, because what I'd like you to do, Ollie, if you wouldn't mind, is give us a little bit of history on the Single Malts of Scotland brand / label. And for us here in the US, it's very new. But for me, as a collector of independently bottled whiskeys, I've been buying Single Malts of Scotland for close to 10 years now, buying it overseas or bringing it back from a trip overseas. So it's a much older label, just new to the US. Could you go into some of the history of how it started?
Yeah, so Single Malts of Scotland, the first bottling with that name was 2002. And it was kind of Secunder's, I guess, technically his second label. His first label was Whiskey Exchange. So he bottled under the Whiskey Exchange. I'm pretty sure his first bottling was like a 5-year-old Jura or something. It has a terrible label. And then he did a bottling of, that's my beep that tells me I'm supposed to be on here. He did a bottling of, I want to say Tomatin 30-year-old in sherry butt.
Oh, wow.
Under Single Malts of Scotland had a massive map on the front. Like, it always makes you laugh because you look back at these labels and it definitely looks like you can tell what technology everyone had at the time. You remember when the paper out of the printers always had the things down the side?
Oh yeah, what are they? The green bar.
Yeah,
whatever. I know
and all the labels from then looked like it was cut out from that paper and stuck on a bottle. But I'm sure it looked pretty fancy at the time. Anyway, that was his first bottling under Single Malts of Scotland. And I don't think at the time it was a conscious thought to start a kind of a label or a brand particularly. it was just, almost say what it is, and then I think it went for a couple of changes, and the first kind of time I start seeing it as like a label that Skinder was actively bottling and exporting is probably around 2004, 2005, like definitely 05, 06, 07. He had these kind of black labels. It had a silver surround or a gold surround, and the silver surround was multiple casks, and the gold surround was single casks. And the silver surrounds were 46%, and the gold surrounds were cask strength. And that was, I'm never sure if that's exactly the idea, because he can't tell me, he can't remember, and I basically buy those up. I just go to auctions. You can buy them for pennies, so they're relatively pennies. So I've been buying up loads of those recently. And then it's gone for a couple of changes since then. So we went to a really modern label in about 2011, I guess it was. And that was all black, and it looked a little bit like a Delphi, only more black. Really difficult to read. We changed that because I moved from the shop where I had to sell them and couldn't read the labels, and it drove me slightly insane. And we always used to put colors on, so they were color coded to the region, and that was a pet hate of mine, because I'd be standing in the shop having to describe a whiskey to someone, and they'd be like, also it's is it Isla Speyside whatever, and part of my thing in the shops, I'd be telling people, well, that's kind of irrelevant, and you'd be showing things like Ben Riach, and you'd be showing them. So we changed all of that to the labels we've got today, which are these kind of lovely cream labels with pictures on. That was about 2014. We did that because we worked out that we're essentially children. We like pictures. That's it. Our designer hates it a little bit because he has to hand draw all the pictures. I think
your artist he's an amazing. I should say he. I shouldn't just assume he.
So he does everything. Like everything we do, all our design is done by one guy, and he. I think the first time we did it, he was like, "This is great," and then I kept adding distilleries, and he'd be like, "Some like realization, this will never end."
Never.
I'm drawing these stupid pictures forever.
Well, I mean, you can get to what, 127 maybe.
Yeah, but I'm going to launch Single Grains of Scotland, and we'll have all sorts of fun then. And it's only just begun. So yeah, but it was like I think we probably had this conversation last time. It was basically an extension of the shop and an extension of his hobby. And like a lot of independent bottlers, it's buy a cask, bottle a cask, and then you find small batches. You buy a couple of casks, and they work better together. So that's what you do. And even up until I'd say about 2017, we really didn't think of it as a brand. Like we didn't used to talk about it as a brand. There was no talk of a label, like a conceptual idea of how you'd launch it or how you'd talk about it. It was just independent bottling. You just bung a cask you like and a bottle, and then.
So was there never a set schedule? Like right now, when we're looking at importing your casks, the first run had 10 casks, and now we're looking at 5, and then another 5. And so how did it work early on? Was it just haphazard, or?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it's relatively haphazard today. I don't think you can be too structured in kind of classic independent bottling. I think a lot of companies want to be, and certainly we get pushed to be. Like we get pushed from whether it's the importers in different countries who want a certain amount of stock, or the marketing team that want to be able to tell everyone what's happening, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is, you're searching through lots of casks for really good things, right? And you genuinely don't know. Like it's not like everything you buy, there's always you buy 100 casks, there's definitely gonna be 10 good ones. and they'll be good now. That's not how it works. You can buy 100 casks and find absolutely nothing good, and you have to go and rework every cask, everything, and go back to the drawing board. And one of the things, I actually think one of our strengths is in some ways that lack of structure, because it's something I worried about really early on in when I started in 2013 with this bit of the business. I remember asking Skinner, what happens if we don't find anything good? And he's like, well, you don't bottle anything then.
Yep. And it's the right attitude, I think.
It is. We're very lucky. Like I don't say that in a boastful way. We don't have to, right? I don't have that pressure. I'm very fortunate to work in a company where we're a secondary business. We're still a hobby. We're still a bit of fun, like a big bit of fun, but we're still a bit of fun. And although there's more pressure now to bottle whiskey, we have to be bottling whiskey. I still don't. We write down a wish list at the start of the year, and you say, I would love to do 40 casks or 100 casks, and then you go and find them. But it's always got that caveat on it. We'll try. We're going to try.
Yeah.
And like with you guys with ImpEx, it's great. It's been great launching into the States, but one of the first things was how many casks. It's like, well, we would love to do 10 or we'd love to do 20. And you go, right, I will try and find you that. It should be possible given what we own.
Yeah.
But there's a caveat in there of like, there is a chance we just don't know. You could have a bad year, it does happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. You mentioned something, and you've explained this to me before, but I'm hoping you'll explain to the folks that are listening. And by the way, for everybody who's just signing on, we currently have Ollie Chilton, the man, the myth, the absolute legend, with us here, and we're discussing. Oh, I have to turn that off. That'll just stay there forever if I don't turn that off. There we go. You had mentioned you'll get some casks and they need to be reworked. Now, there's a certain segment of people that will say, oof, that sounds like finishing, and finishing's a bad thing. I don't necessarily agree with that segment of people, but I can understand the rationale behind that. But I don't think working on a cask or fixing the liquid is necessarily a finish. There's also re-racking as well, which is not necessarily a finish. So I wonder if you can go through some of the ins and outs of what you mean by fixing some of that whiskey.
So I guess, the first thing is that there's, well, firstly, in terms of the finishing thing, it technically is a finish, right? A finish is you move it into another cask, although the regulations on it are pretty, are not as well laid out as maybe some aspects of the SWA's regulations. But essentially, as soon as you move a cask from its original cask to something new, it's no longer a single cask and it's now something else, right? It becomes a finish and it becomes something else. And there's no kind of like statute on time,
right.
Which I've always found kind of madness, because in my head a finish is like 6 months, but it could be 8 years. But then you start getting into that whole, okay, well, what has done the most work and all the rest. I largely think all of that's kind of irrelevant. It's not really the point. I guess the main point is you can fall into two camps, and both have very good points, and it's about how you view independent bottling, I guess. You either believe that an independent bottler's job is that to search through casks to only find the good ones, right? Mm-hmm. So you're a hunter for the rare and the wonderful. Mm. Or you view it a little bit more as an invasive job, right? So I'm a big believer that whiskey is about people. There was actually a good article, I think it was published yesterday, by Becky Paskin on this, but it's a conversation I know I've had with her, and I've had with a few other people quite a few times. When I say whiskey's about people, I don't mean that there's some kind of like cultural thing. I mean, there is an aspect of that which is in her article, but what I mean is from a very practical point of view, people make whiskey, right? Barley, water, yeast are the ingredients. You can, buying better ingredients will hopefully make for better whiskey, but the reality is you can buy the best ingredients when you're cooking in the world, and if you shit cook, it's crap, right? So it doesn't matter what you do. If you don't do it well, it's rubbish. And I kind of see independent bottling in the same school, right? So I don't see my job as the guy who just goes and searches for whiskey. I see my job as a curator of our cask selection, someone who looks after it, who manages it, and that I see our job as caring for that liquid. So I strongly believe that although there are great spirits and good spirits in Scotland, and there are bad spirits, although they're few and far between in reality, there is certainly good wood and knackered wood. And there are spirits that lend themselves to knackered wood, and then there are spirits that need more active wood. And recognizing all of that, it's sadly not quite as simple as that puzzle is part of the job. So, I'm sure you've experienced, Joshua, when you're doing cask sampling, you quite often get stuff where you're viewing it and you're going, well, wouldn't it be better if it was just a bit richer or a bit sweeter? Or maybe you can taste certain notes in it that point to the wood developing flavors that frankly aren't very nice. So then it's about how you manage that. Now, because we're not out buying one cask at a time, in the old days, everyone was out. You could sample a cask, buy a cask, sample a cask, buy a cask. You only had to buy the stuff you liked. Nowadays, everybody wants whiskey, right? So getting samples of casks is pretty tough. And certainly when you get into bigger parcels, it becomes very difficult. So your job becomes more about managing what you've already purchased and making it the best it can possibly be. And I think that's actually true throughout. So like Single Malts of Scotland, you'll notice none of the bottles ever say cask strength. They will never say cask strength.
Yeah, right.
It's not because some of them aren't cask strength, some of them are, but if you write cask strength on a label, it has to be the strength that came out of cask.
Sure.
And that doesn't allow you the option to say, oh, well, actually it tastes a bit better if it's reduced by 2%. So I'll reduce it by 2% because my job is, I feel, to put the best thing I can put together into a bottle. Even if that's a single cask, it's still my job to make sure it performs as well as it could, and the person drinking it enjoys it as much as I hope they will. That is not to detract from the other way of selecting casks, where your job is just to go out and find something that tastes really good, because we've done that too. So, when buying in the old days, when I used to buy single casks for whiskey exchange, that's exactly the job. And you're in the fortunate position working for a retailer that you can pick and choose, and you can just buy what you want, and you only have to buy one cask. That's a great job. You feel really lucky to be part of it, but that's not how I view our business today or my job today. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it makes complete sense. I think the fact of the matter is, there are different aspects to independent bottling and different approaches to independent bottling. And you yourself are one of those unusual, I almost called you an unusual person. It's not that you're an unusual person. You're well, maybe you're a little unusual.
I've got a growth, if that makes sense.
I thought they just called that a tail. Is that not a tail? But the point I'm trying to get at is, with the position that you're in, you're approaching independent bottling from a few different perspectives. You've got the one that you've just discussed with Single Malts of Scotland, where sometimes it's cask strength, sometimes you bring it down a little bit, sometimes you're reworking the liquid, finishing it in different casks, maybe putting it in similar casks, but the wood's no longer knackered. But then you've got the Port Ascaig side of it, also independently bottled whiskey, but now you're creating batches and such. And so I took a long time to say, yeah, that makes complete sense, right? There's no one size fits all to independently bottled whiskey.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's certainly. I think I'm sure I said this last time. It's by far the most interesting category in Scotch whisky, and that is without wanting to take away from any of the speakers you've had on this, because I'm a massive fan of Kilchoman. Particularly, I love Kilchoman in terms of Scotch whisky. I could go into all the rest as well because I also like Penderyn, etc., but I will stop. But I always feel that when you're on that journey through whiskey, independent bottling, the scope to find new flavors is so vast. And that's what I enjoy most about the category. I enjoy the girth of flavor. So I like the fact that you can have different attitudes. And we actually, as a company, so I've got lots of different labels. Single Malts of Scotland's our biggest kind of classic independent bottling label. And I attach a philosophy to it. So we attach a style, almost a style across it, if that makes any sense at all, because you've got different cask types. We've got everything's quite classic. So as we try the whiskies, and I know you've got some there we'll talk about, they're relatively classic in nature, relatively close to distillate style. Like some of the ones have been brought up tonight, Ben Nevis, Leadcheck. Leadcheck's filthy, right? It's a filthy distillate. It's basically diesel. It's as close to diesel as whiskey gets, and it's a wonderful thing. And I love celebrating that in Single Malts of Scotland. But every now and again, you do get whiskies that are off from their distillate style. They're off from what you'd expect, and it doesn't make them bad. It just means they don't fit Single Malts of Scotland. So instead of just saying, "Oh well, that doesn't work for us. We won't bottle that," I just invent a new label, and then we have a completely new concept and a new thing, and a bit more fun because you can take a different approach.
Well, that actually answers a question that Vlad had brought up about how do you decide where a cask goes. And I think that we touched on it a little bit 2 weeks ago when we were comparing the Port Ascaig line to the Elements of Islay line, where Port Ascaig is focused more on the balance, more on the elegance, and Elements of Islay is the more
mental.
More mental, yeah. Thank you. I couldn't think of the word. So. So how many, I want to focus on Single Malts of Scotland, and I want to show people what I'm drinking, but just out of curiosity, the people who are watching us know you as the Port Ascaig and Single Malts of Scotland person, but what other labels under the Whiskey Exchange rubric are you responsible for?
So I don't do much with Whiskey Exchange anymore because they've got a fantastic buyer in Dawn Davies who looks after all of their most of their single cask project, along with Sekinder. Obviously, Sekinder's still heavily involved in everything TWE. The only thing I kind of get involved a bit is some of the independent bottling stuff. And that's just because I'm quite close to those companies. But in terms of Elixir Distillers, we have Single Malts of Scotland, Port Ascaig, Elements of Islay, and then we've got a small label called Whiskey Trail, which you will almost never come across. I don't do many bottlings under it, and it's just where we put slightly mental stuff we find from other distilleries. So grain, blended malt, blend, you name it, all fits into there. And I often refer to it as our kind of our Euro labels because it's unapologetically follows the kind of trend of European independent bottlers. So there was a massive growth over the last 10 years out of Germany, particularly, of new independent bottling labels, and some of them, like Whiskey Agency, are wonderful. Like they're wonderful bottlers, and I love the big, colourful labels. Like I love the
art is fantastic.
And our designer, so the guy who does all Single Malts of Scotland labels, he and I used to do, we still do, we have a lot of fun each year for Whiskey Show. We do just anything we can think of, really.
Mm-hmm.
And Whiskey Trail came out of that because we had all these labels that we couldn't use because no one in Whiskey Exchange wanted them. So I just declared one day, oh, well, I'll just export them around the world instead. So we've done any idea that two of us can think of. We've done it and had some fun with it.
Wow.
And that's where we put the kind of the less distillate driven, the less obvious whiskies. And then there's like odd projects that you do, like that come across your desk. You're like, why not? Let's have fun with that. We'll do that. And it comes back to that being a relatively small independent business with, essentially I've got two owners, right? I've got two brothers own our company. They're both been in the booze industry their entire lives, and there's no pressure on us we don't have to report to shareholders, so we don't have that pressure. It's just go and do something as long as it's fun and as long as the liquid's good and it's enjoyable, and it doesn't sit on the shelf forever. Everyone's happy. So it does give us a bit of freedom to have fun. That being said, Single Malts of Scotland is probably my favorite label because in a lot of ways it fits more with my drinking.
Same. Yep.
So I love the weird and wacky stuff, and I enjoy tasting it. But if it's drinking, I'm conservative with a small C. I'm very, that means nothing in the States, does it? I mean, I've just said something that's incredibly British. Sorry about that. Basically, I don't necessarily want outlandish flavors. What I quite like is, I guess, what I class as quite classic Scotch whiskey. And Single Malts of Scotland definitely kind of fits there. Again, it's probably more along the lines of elegant whiskey and balanced flavors.
Yep. Which I think is one of the reasons I was drawn to the brand when I first discovered it. It just, and I think you and I have very similar palates where we like spirit-driven flavors. We like to taste the DNA of that distillery and not typically not let it get too flooded. And I think the Single Malts of Scotland brand, the label, definitely highlights that. That's one of the reasons why I was attracted to it. So before, there was another question that came in, but before we tend to that, I just want to show people what I've got in my glass. So this was from the first run that came into the US, Imperial Distillery, a shuttered distillery, 30 years in a bourbon barrel, 43.3% alcohol. What do you have in your glass, Ollie? Or what are you about to pour?
I'm starting with, I've just finished one, so I should probably drink something different, but I'm not going to. I have another one. I'm having, there's the camera, Clynelish. So this is the, I think this was in the last batch as a 10-year-old, is that right?
Correct. Yes.
No, this is a new one. This is a new one, right?
The 10. Okay. Yeah. Yep. You were 100% correct. Yeah. 57.4% alcohol.
Yeah. Clynelish 10-year-old from the new batch, which was part of a parcel we were lucky to pick up a few years ago of Clynelish in first fill bourbon barrels. And it was one of those instances where we were offered something that almost felt like they were apologetic for offering it. It was kind of like, oh, well, we have this if you want it. And you sit there like trying not to look excited.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, well, it's only whatever it was at the time, 8 years old. Well, okay, we could take that off your hands.
If we must.
Thank you. And it was, I mean, the wood's been really good. So, I mean, it's all first fill bourbon barrels that came from a really good supplier, which is great because it costs us no money. We didn't have to re-rack anything. But the nicer thing about it was nothing's overpowered. Clynelish is a relatively rich spirit, and this is that kind of rich, waxy, honeyed, quite luxurious whiskey. And I think even at 10 years old, it's just really Moorish. Hence the reason I now poured myself another glass. Calm down.
That's great. So this is actually this question is apropos. So you mentioned you were offered a parcel of Clynelish. So from Brian Devoret. Are you buying from brokers? Do you buy from distilleries? How does all that work?
I mean, I'm pretty slutty. I'll take it anywhere.
We've heard that about you.
No, I mean, the thing is, we do a lot of work with some of the brokers, and the brokerage market is really important to Scotch whisky, and this exists for time immemorial. We do buy from we do work with some distillers, some smaller ones and some bigger ones. Sometimes it's small parcels, sometimes it's regular filling contracts. Sometimes, what I've learned over the last 7 years is that you've got to be relatively flexible. Back in the old days, it was easy. You went to a broker and you bought as much Port Ellen as you wanted, as much Ardbeg as you wanted. I mean, it's really frightening. I look back because I've got all the stock records of everything we've purchased, and I can look back in the days of Duncan Taylor, when Duncan Taylor started out and Dougie Lang moved into single cask bottling. I can see what was being sold and traded and the prices in it. You just sit there going, it's a whole. I'm like it feels kind of crazy. Though at the time, obviously, it was actually quite hard to sell. So swings and roundabouts, I guess.
Yeah, right.
But nowadays, we try and build connections where we can. But I have several brokers I've worked with for 7 years since I started working for Secunda, and some of those relationships are really helpful. So it just depends. It just depends what it is and where it's coming from. And never say no to a possible relationship. You never know, even when it seems ridiculous.
There was, for a good while, and anyone who's watching this who follows independently bottled whiskey might have seen this sort of dip in the independent bottling world, and I'm bringing this up because I'm pouring Imperial right now, but it seemed that there was a point in time where a lot of bottlers were bottling Imperial, and then all of it went away, and it was just signatory bottling Imperial after Imperial after Imperial, with of course Gordon MacPhail has their Imperial label, and Jason and I with our company looked for years for Imperial, simply couldn't find it, and then all of a sudden, Single Malts of Scotland has a 30-year-old. There's a 23-year-old that's coming out. How does that work? Where all of a sudden there's a glut, and then seemingly now there's a good bit of whiskey from one distillery or another distillery popping up.
So it's probably the best representation of the economics of Scotch whisky, and what happens in an industry where you're trying to predict the future, right? So what you always have to bear in mind is that all of the big companies and all the small companies to some degree, but all of the big companies are gambling essentially banks' money, right? They're taking a bunch of cash and they're putting it into new make spirit on the basis that they're going to sell that as whiskey at a point in the future, and they'll pick that point. So they'll say, it'll be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. They'll say, right, the market's going to grow like this, and their job is to literally guess where in the world the market's going to grow and what that market's going to want.
Wow.
Which, when you think about it, is properly insane.
It's no one's arrived with a crystal ball. It's really a shot in the dark, right?
So the easiest way to look at it is to take the really long view.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take whiskey as a marketplace in the 70s, it was pretty buoyant. Through the 60s and the 70s, it was one of the most popular spirits in the world. Mm-hmm. Come the late 70s, it started to see as fusty and old-fashioned, and people moved into buying vodka and white spirits, and it's the rise of Malibu and Bacardi, and all of that comes through the 80s. Mm-hmm. And whiskey dies, and everybody listening to this has probably heard the whiskey locks, and there's just so much whiskey being laid down. And the other thing is, because there's now this drive to make it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, because we've got to compete with these white spirits, there's more and more and more of it because it's cheaper per litre to make more. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So you now have this issue. You've got all of this whiskey that's got nowhere to go. And that decline in sales, it lasted one way or another all the way through the 80s, pretty much all the way through the 90s, to the extent that, at least in the UK, just before I started working in whiskey retail, whiskey was seen as a supermarket product competing with vodka. So it was not uncommon that bottles were as cheap as £11 on the shelf. Supermarket blend, £11, and it's still more expensive to make than vodka. So the margins are smaller. So it doesn't seem very worthwhile, right? So there's no money in, or it's seen as no money in whiskey, or little money in whiskey. So the end result, you've now got all this stock, and it's got to go somewhere, and everyone's trying to get rid of it. Mm-hmm. And hence the reason during that period in the 90s, there's all these parcels of stock. Like we mentioned Port Ellen, and there's a story I remember Andrew Symington telling me years ago about walking into a pub and someone selling him 20 casks of Port Ellen, and they were basically giving it away because nobody wanted it. And that's where that starts from, and it just becomes progressively bigger. So then you start getting companies who, like the Douglas Langs of the world and the signatories particularly, who recognize, Fred Lang was a genius. Andrew Symington was a genius, because what they recognized was it's really good quality, it tastes really good, and people will pay for this if we explain it to them, if we tell it to them properly, if we explain why it's worth the money. So they buy up parcels and they start bottling it as single malt, as single cask, as independent bottled stuff. And distillers will sell off parcels of whiskey that they don't need anymore, and they bottle it. And you'll get a period of time, and this still goes on. So you'll have a period of time where some transaction happens and someone needs to get rid of it because their marketing's not worked out the way they thought. And suddenly everybody is bottling one thing.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. It's all the brokers are selling it. It's everywhere. And if you're really clever as an independent bottler and you're Andrew Symington, what you do is you go and buy everything, and then you're the only one left holding Imperial for the rest of the time. And that's essentially where that comes from, is this rolling thing of, we had a plan and it didn't work out, and so we have to sell the stock off. Anyway, I was completely lost in the track of thought there.
Well, you started making a point that I was thinking something in my head when you were talking about the 10-year-old Clynelish, and you had purchased a parcel of it at 8 years old. And my guess is you were excited for two reasons. A, it was really good 8-year-old whiskey that you could probably bottle a few casks here and there, and it'll be great young Clynelish. But also you could do what Andrew Symington did with his Imperial years ago, is you sit on it for a good long while, and then 10 years from now it becomes great 20-year-old Clynelish, 22-year-old, as it gets older and older.
So So I'm going to always sound like I'm shouting out other people rather than ourselves, but Signatory is probably the best example of how to run an independent bottled business. They manage stock. That's what they do. They do it insanely well, and they do it because they love liquid, right? And I know that Andrew and Des are two of my very close friends, and it's such a wonderful thing to meet them, because you get inspired to talk to them about liquid. They're drinkers, they're proper drinkers. But it is exactly that. So it's seeing where you could take the stock and having that long view of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and how you can manage that through. And know that, at the start, 8-year-old whiskey, you can't sell it for that much money, and you maybe don't make as much at the start, but by the end, it's all going to work out quite well. But it's all about that management of that stock, which doesn't sound at all romantic, but honestly is probably more impressive to me when you meet someone who does it really well. You see those companies doing it really, really well. Something that I was thinking of in exactly that term, and I sound like I'm blowing our own trumpet, but I remember a few years ago, I was looking around and all the new IBs were bottling the same stuff. And we launched some Bruichladdich 92, and Signatory launched some Bruichladdich, I think it was 1990, and Cadenhead's released some Bruichladdich 92. And I know for a fact that none of that stock, all that stock was sold in 2006, 2007. And it was all sold essentially to everybody. And if the funny thing is, you can go back and you can see all the IBs at the time, all the different independent bottlers bottling it and selling it, bottling it, selling it, bottling and selling it. And what Sukhinder did, and what Andrew did, and what Hedley Wright and the guys at Cadenheads did, was they put some by, and they said, well, just forget about that, we'll come back to it later. And it was glorious. It's glorious liquid. It's just properly spectacular whiskey. And you think to yourself, that's such a lovely thing to be able to do.
That's very cool. And so that's is that a goal for you? So obviously, one aspect of bottling whiskey independently is just that, you're bottling whiskey independently. But then there's the back end, the cask management portion of it. Is that a focus for you? A focus for Sukhinder?
It's a large part of my job today, and it is something I take great pride and pleasure in trying to look at, and how we will build for the future. You did that interview on Single Cask Nation with Cara Lang, and I can't imagine being in a family business where you're talking about something your grandfather bought. That's pretty magical. But I certainly think from my own personal business point of view, I really love the idea that when I'm retiring and I'm 70 years old and someone's finally pushing me out the door of Elixir Distillers, that there will be casks that I bought now that they'll be able to bottle. That, I'm always thinking that would be nice. To think that something's gone with you on that journey would be really good. And there's certainly a lot of pleasure in rediscovering the things you bought, both personally and professionally, because I've just been doing a review of my bottles of whiskey, and I found 3 bottles I didn't know I had. So there's, I kind of feel like casks are the same. It's always those casks you forgot that you bought. So we just did some reviews of samples of Macduff in sherry that I think I bought in 2014. So it would be one of my really early transactions, and I'm pretty sure I fought pretty hard to buy it, given how young it was, and Sukhinder was a bit like, oh, no one cares. And I got the samples in, and they were gorgeous, and I was just like, yes, I waited 6 years for you to be good.
Oh, that's fantastic. So actually, that's another good segue to a question that Travis Williams had a bit earlier on. Do you search out specific distilleries to bottle and request samples, or do distilleries send you the samples and hope that you will select and bottle for them as an IB? So really two questions there, but let's as we're pouring whiskey, and I really want to know what you just poured, unless it's the same thing. Are you just
No.
plain leashing it all night? Yeah.
No, I think I said to you just before or earlier today. I found that this is quite therapeutic for me because normally I get to try everything that comes off the bottling line, but because of COVID, I've not been in the office since the new stuff for the States came in. So I actually got the samples last week, and then I got ill, so I didn't try anything last week. So I'm actually trying most of this stuff for the first time since I sampled it, and it always tastes better in the bowl. Almost I'd say 99%.
Right. Yeah.
So it's one of those things when you're trying something and there's that giddy sense of joy that it tastes great, and then it's even better because you realize, oh, it's something I was part of. That's right. So I'm going to try an Orkney distillery. We've taken pretty big liberties with this one because we've put an Orkney distillery and we've put a picture on it. So just in case anyone figure out what that is.
Is that the not Scapa distillery?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you it's not Scapa because some of the vintage we have, Scapa was closed. That was a pretty big
one. I am fresh out of all of my single malts of Scotland from run 1. The second run of single malts of Scotland has. Oh, you know what? I will open. I have a bottle from the second run, but I'm not going to open that yet. So for now, I'm going to open. This is one of my favorite Glentalkers, and I just pure magic. So keep some Glentalkers for us in the US, please.
Chivas distilleries are something else. We didn't have many. We got them in a swap.
Okay.
Anyway, going back to the question, as you say, it's kind of two parts. So yes, it's the answer to the first part is yes. We do search out certain distilleries and particularly certain vintages. I'm a great believer in vintage in whiskey. Vintage is really important. Not in the same way as wine. It has nothing to do with how the barley was grown. Any company who is selling you that line, you need to slap hard. It's not that you can't get different flavors from different barleys, but the process of making whiskey is a relatively complex one and involves lots of chemical changes. So by proxy, the barley is not the main thing causing flavor. But vintage is important because every year distilleries are run slightly differently. In fact, every month they're run slightly differently. But you'll have changes, and it's the same changes as I spoke about with availabilities of casks. So if there's lots of money and everything's running well and you want to make lots of liquid because you believe in 10 years, you're going to run your distillery quite hard and make as much liquid as possible. Now, ironically, when times are really bad and your distillery is hardly running at all, you might only open 3 days a week, but your washbacks will be full. So all your ferments are suddenly longer, and your production changes. And some distillery companies will tell you that they're consistent year on year, but largely I believe that's, outside of a few companies, it's largely incorrect. And whiskies are batchy, right? Scotch whiskey is batch. It's a batch process. Everything's a batch process. And then it's the job of the blenders to try and make things taste similar or the same. That's their job. And some are better than others, and some have an easier job than others, and that is a distinct difference. But as an independent bottler, vintage becomes very important. So there are some vintages that are standout. Bemore 93, it's phenomenal. I've never had anything bad. In fact, I would argue it's one of the most amazing vintages of any distillery that ever existed. And there's very few. You won't see many. It's a really low yield year, high floor malting content. I mean, like there's all sorts of aspects to it that probably drove that flavor profile, which I have sadly researched because it interests me. But all of those things are true at every distillery. Like there's all those small changes will make for a different distillate. Slight differences, but they get exaggerated over time.
Yeah, sure.
And then there are obviously distilleries that we favor. Some purely commercially, they're easy to sell. Like, who wouldn't want all of the Laphroaig and Ardbeg in the world? It's easy to sell. On the flip side, the Laphroaig and Ardbeg also taste really good. So, hence the reason they're easy to sell. But there are distilleries like Ben Nevis. I love Ben Nevis. I'm obsessed with Ben Nevis. And I mean, I know these are the first two whiskies that were named in the chat, so it seems like I'm going on. But Leduc, in fact, Tobermory is probably my distillery of the year this year for no other reason than the 12 is tasting really good.
The 12-year-old Tobermory?
Yeah, just the standard. It's brilliant.
Wow. Okay.
And Leduc 10's great. Leduc generally I love.
Yeah,
but I think so as an independent bottler, you obviously want to buy the things you love, like Clynelish. Who wouldn't want to buy a Clynelish every day? But it's not always easy to do that. So it's also the distilleries that maybe people don't know well, and even you don't know well, that you discover. So my big one, not recently, but over the last 5 years, was Glenbergie. I didn't really know Glenbergie at all before 2017. Yeah, I guess it's 2017. I hadn't really had much Glenbergie. I'd had the occasional bottle like Signatory, or it wasn't something that was high on my list. And then I was chatting to a good friend at Chivas who said, Glenbergie, you've got to drink Glenbergie. And then we got offered a parcel of Glenbergie, so we bought it. And everything was just amazing.
Your 21-year-old from earlier this year was
that one,
just drop dead gorgeous,
almost gone. So yes, we do concentrate on distilleries. The second part of the question is, do distilleries approach you to beg to sell you whiskey? Simple answer is no, not now, because single malt whiskey is now a massive market, right? And if you went back even 15 years ago, it just wasn't the same place. No, companies weren't focused on single malt in the same way. The old figure used to be 98% of the whiskey sold in the world is blended whiskey and 2% is single malt. Now it's probably more like 12% is single malt today. And companies know that, and they make more money from it, and they want to sell more single malt. So it's that brings in other obstacles like marketing teams and lawyers who have no interest in what we do. They don't really understand who we are or what we are, and we're treated with disdain because they think we're going to ruin their brand. I made a joke about a distillery recently who may have, I won't go into the details, but may have asked us to take their name off one aspect of our bottle, something that I believe you know about, Joshua. And I may have made the joke. I don't know what their problem is. I'm going to make their brand look better than they do. I don't use anything people ask, and it tastes amazing. And that might sound arrogant, and it might sound completely over the top, and it is. But it's very easy, I think, for these marketing companies and lawyers who don't know the history that Gordon MacPhail, Cadenheads, Berry Brothers and Rudd built almost every whiskey brand.
Everyone,
probably outside of Glenfiddich, they built all of them. Macallan, Mortlach. These distilleries wouldn't have been heard of without G&M. It's almost unthinkable without those.
Wow. Yeah, it's really interesting if you just pause and think about it. Single malt Scotch whiskey bottled by the distillery or by the company that owns the distillery is a very new thing. It was independently bottled whiskeys, it was blends, but single malt in and of itself, bottled by the distillery, is kind of new, right?
Well, yes and no. So there are lots of examples of single malt being bottled as single malt by companies. One of the best you'll find is Ardbeg and Laphroaig, particularly for the US in the 1920s, because it was illegal apart from when it was medicine. so therefore it's okay. And you'll find there's lots of companies who can show you bottles, but they were regular branding of single malt whiskey didn't
that's what I meant.
Yeah, that didn't arrive till the 50s, with late 50s with Glenfiddich, and then through the 60s with Macallan started and a few others. I always remember someone from Glendronach telling me once, and they were like, you know, back in the 60s, we were one of the top 6 single malts in the world. And I smiled and I said, so how many different branded single malts were there? He was like, yeah, about 6. Yeah, about that. And he said it with a great smile. I mean, it's like,
yeah.
And it's being silly because there are probably a few more, but not massively marketed and not pushed. Whereas, you know, in Italy, you could buy anything you wanted from Gin or Cannet. And then you look at the Italian importers, Samaroli and Moon Import, and these guys who bottled, frankly, legendary whiskey, and it's changed the perception of whiskey today. Like, genuinely has changed how people view it as a commodity. That I preach because I believe so strongly in independent bottling, and obviously I'm biased, but I can show you all of the movements in it. So no, sadly, distilleries don't phone me up saying, could you put or established distilleries rarely phone you up and say, could you put our whiskey in one of your independent bottling? But we are finding some new distilleries who do want to talk to you and do want to have that conversation. And I think they come from a different attitude. They come from a whiskey drinking attitude, and they understand our place in that network. And you do sometimes want to show distillery companies and be like, look, I realize it's not going to sell 1 million cases of your standard single malt. I'm not going to convert. I'm not going to convert the guy who's coming along drinking Jim Beam to drinking Bowmore 12. I'm not, I don't have that power. But what I can do is I can probably convert people who are really into whiskey into drinking a distillery they've never heard of, one by one, and we'll do the work. Like we'll do the legwork if you'll give us access. But sadly that conversation rarely happens.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think Travis's question, it was Travis that asked it, was a good one about our distilleries phoning you up to bottle their whiskey. And what's interesting is that question came around just as we highlighted this bottle that says, here's a 14-year-old whiskey from an Orkney distillery, right? There, you don't even have the distillery name to put on the bottle. However, you have bottled whiskey from a distillery that's also on Orkney called Highland Park. As an independent bottler, I know you're seeing this more and more, where distilleries they're offering casks, or brokers are offering casks from Glen whomever. But the stipulation comes that you cannot use the distillery name for various and sundry reasons. And so my question to you is, obviously that it's still great whiskey. You're only going to bottle the stuff that you think is worthy to go in a bottle with your label. But how do you think that affects that practice where distilleries are withholding the distillery name? How do you think that's currently affecting independent bottlers? And do you think it will have long-term effects, be they positive or negative?
So please bear in mind, it's now 2:30 in the morning, and this is a conversation just between you and I, right? No one's listening.
There's no one here. No one here at all.
Yeah. So there's two aspects, right? The first, and I don't just say this from a legal standpoint, but it is true. I hope that our name and our reputation is enough to sell any bottle of whiskey. So if I put my name to a bottle, or if Sukhinder puts his name to a bottle, and we write Elixir Distillers on it, Our job is to make sure that everything that goes in with our name on is very good quality. So you should trust it. I hope that's how independent bottling is supposed to work.
Right.
However, the reality is most people walk into a shop and they expect to see a distillery name, right? They expect to know where it's from, and that is completely fair to want to know where something is from.
Agreed.
I wouldn't argue that hiding a name is good. Sometimes you don't have a choice, and then, well, you have a choice. You could not bottle it, I guess. But then, if the liquid tastes good and you get it at a good price, hey ho. But it definitely makes things more difficult from in some sales points of view. The larger question, how do I think it affects the industry, is I worry about it greatly. I understand where it comes from. It comes from an insecurity. It comes from seeing a distillery name as a brand and a brand as an asset. And that's really, this is really not very interesting chat, but there you go.
No, it definitely is. No, you're this is good. This is all good.
So, you know, that's where it comes from. It's from the same school of thought that, you know, a Gillette razor is better because it says Gillette on it, right? Gillette has value, right? So if anyone writes something like Gillette on it, that's a bad thing. That's where it comes from. That's the existence. If someone writes Highland Park on it, Highland Park is all about Vikings, and we've done Vikings, and we own Vikings. You know, and you can all feck off. Highland Park's Vikings. The problem I have is I view distilleries differently to that. I view them not only as buildings and not only as brands, but I view them as a place where history is created. And I realize that sounds very arty-farty. You'll have to bear with me. I have a philosophy degree. I'm really sorry. But I view whiskey as an integral part of mankind's ability to, well, people's kind, because women do it too, much better than men mostly.
This is true.
To create something that one changes people's perceptions on the world. It creates new flavors. It creates experiences. It creates friendships. It creates stuff. Whiskey is a magical juice. It creates magical stuff, and it comes from these amazing places, and we should celebrate those amazing places. And everything in that bottle is related to the history of that place and the people at that place. And by not putting the name on, you're not able to point people to it, and they can't relate. And I worry about that. I also worry that the regulations are not strict, which might sound mental. Like, I wouldn't mind if you couldn't put a distillery name, but you can put Speyside single malt whiskey, and then that allows people to speculate. And so now we've got like dozens of different Speyside single malt whiskey. There's over 60 distilleries. And now people start speculating, or worse still, companies start telling you things that they don't know. You know, they speculate. And I am guilty as the next man at doing this, right? I do it with some of the whiskeys we've bought. I've bought Islay single malt whiskey from the early 90s. In my opinion, it's probably the Freud, but I don't know. I don't know any more than anyone else. And I try and say that. We try and write it on our labels, and we try and tell people when we talk to them, we don't know. We don't know. This is what we think, but we don't know. But I do know that people are going to walk away from that tasting, and they're going to tell people, well, Ollie Chilton says it's Lefroy. So it's Lefroy. Because he obviously does know. And I can sit there and shake you till I'm blue in the face saying, no, I really don't. I was really sold it as Islay single malt whiskey. And the issue there becomes, am I now misleading the customer? Am I now misleading people? Are they buying it for the wrong reason? And that can relate, you know, the big danger and the end result and my end fear for Scotch whiskey, and this is a very general fear, is that as soon as you create a world in which people can't believe you, can't trust you, especially with something like Scotch whiskey, where the rules have been so integral to building that brand, the brand of Scotch whiskey, which is so powerful, as soon as you make that, you build any mistrust into it, the whole thing just breaks. People stop buying it because they don't trust it anymore.
Yeah.
And so I worry from a global point of view, which all sounds very dramatic and over the top. And you have to understand I'm far too close to it because it's my hobby, it's my work, it's literally my entire life. But
I get it. Yeah.
When I look at it, I look at where is it going to be in 20 years' time? Where is it going to be in 40 years' time? And I remember speaking to someone who said to me, I bought this stock. It doesn't have a name on. I know what it is. Well, in 10 years' time, I'll just put the name back on. And
that doesn't seem right.
There's part of me that understands where they're coming from because the name of the distillate was very obvious. And I understand that they probably could do it, because the other thing we have is it's not regulated. None of this is regulated properly. It's all done with the handshakes and the agreements of the people today, not, whereas if it's in a piece of paper that says, this is from X distillery, and it's from Macallan, but you have purchased it and you cannot sell it unless it is in bottle. And if you sell it in bottle, you cannot put the name on, then that is regulated. But if you just broker out casks that say Speyside single malt whiskey, then you're just leaving it up to the person at the end to be honest about it. And
so you're saying someone, if they so chose to do, received a parcel of whiskey from a Speyside distillery and just put any name on it that they want, if they wanted to.
No, it is, well, depending on the bottling hall, you can probably get away with a certain amount. But let me give you an example. If you put on your bottle from a family-owned Speyside distillery, and you've matured it in sherry, you'd probably believe that's Glenfarclas, right?
That's where my mind went. As soon as you said family owned, I went straight there. Yeah.
But there are a few different distilleries that are family owned, and it depends how you define family owned. I mean, technically, Pernod Ricard is family owned.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it depends how, and as soon as you do that, someone else will say it's Glenfarclas, and before you know it, someone else has bought one of those casks and waited 10 years and just written it on the label. And then John Grant's gone and beaten them with a stick, because he'll still be alive and still be doing that in 20 years' time. But my point is, it's not as controlled as it should be, and it's not as open as it should be. And I worry because I see the back end. So I worry because I see the distilleries where people say what it is, and they don't know. And I know when there are certain people who are honest about it. There are certain people who have seen the cask ends and they know exactly what it is. Right? And I trust those people, but I know that, and the customer doesn't. So the customer doesn't know them personally. The customer's not going up to their warehouse. And there's no reason, frankly, given the number of people able to buy casks and bottle them, for anyone to trust anyone. And that makes our life as an independent bottler more difficult. So I worry because it allows for people to do things that are not right, and then that impacts on us in the end.
Sure,
it makes our reputation more difficult to prove.
Yeah.
Wow, that was really depressing. Can we talk about something more positive?
Let's pour a whiskey, and then we had some questions to tend to, but before we do that, and while you're pouring your whiskey, I just want to highlight to those that are interested, those who have been enjoying the conversation and who are interested in what's coming down the pipe for Single Malts of Scotland for the US. I think this week our warehouse is supposed to receive the next run, and so we have the 14-year-old Orkney, which is what we were just talking about before. There was a 19-year-old from Ardbeg, and
I do have that. I was about to pour that, and then I thought I'll do that at the end.
See, yeah, I need your notes. I haven't tasted that one yet. I'm so excited. Yeah, this is a fun one right here. So I've heard of the Ardmore Distillery, but this is Ard Vor.
So I've just poured.
Yeah, what did you pour?
I just poured Ardmore. There you go, 21-year-old that we did for you guys last year.
Yep, beautiful.
1998, which is wonderful. And for those that don't know, Ardmore is a big distillery that produces an awful lot of whiskey for a famous whiskey brand called Teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And it tends to be slightly smoky. And this kind of goes, this is exactly my point, right? So we bought the 98 we bought some 98 Ardmore a few years ago from a broker. And it's just Ardmore, right? It says Ardmore on the paperwork, and we can write that on the bottle. I've also bought younger Ardmore, and some of that's been bought direct, and some of that's been bought through brokers. But because I had a good relationship with the head of stocks at Beam Suntory at the time, I asked them. I said, "Look, are there any limitations? Anything you're worried about from a distillery point of view?" Because my view has always been, I'd rather have an upfront conversation and ask you what you want. How do you want your brand presented? What are you worried about? And what I was told at the time was, could you please not put Ardmore on the label? So I said, yeah, no problem. And my ops manager, Andrew, who's a wonderful human being, said, why don't we call it Ardmore? I was like, what's that? He goes, it's a Gaelic name. It's the same, but So I sent it to them and said, is this okay? And they were like, yeah, it's fine.
Amazing.
Yeah,
that's
fine.
amazing.
The lawyers won't find that. We don't care. And
wild.
So we only use that for the stock that we agreed with, that we've agreed with them, because the older stock's neither here nor there. Though, to be fair, if they phoned me up tomorrow and said, could you do it on everything, I probably would, even though I don't have to.
Okay.
And it's similar, like Kalila, we don't have to. But we put most of it into Port Escape because, that's our gentleman agreement. We have no contract on that. It's just what we've been asked to do. So, I'm more than happy to work in the parameters that we're given from a company. It doesn't really matter to me. It's their distillery at the end of the day. The only thing that bothers me is when I can't be honest with people. That makes life difficult. But I do love Ardmore, so I still buy it regardless of the principle on it, because I love that balance of smoke. I think then the 98, that period of time, 97, 98, the wood's actually pretty spent. On the 97s, we ended up recasking everything, but the 98s had a bit of life, but they were so green. I mean, it's like agave spirit. It's that, kind of peppery. Like
Yeah.
Whereas the one that's coming in is a 2009 10-year-old, and it's much more active wood. They were actually barrels, but they were refill barrels that had Lafroig.
I was going to ask this. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So they were obviously used for Lafroig during that period of time where Lafroig was all first fill barrels for marketing purposes, and then obviously they don't want to waste the barrels, because you've got to bear in mind that a barrel has a 60-year lifespan, 60-year lifespan, and you've only used it for 10 years, so you might as well use it again. So they use it for Ardmore, which is destined for blending, and luckily for us, blends are in the tank, so we get to buy that stock. It's a really lovely whiskey.
Yeah, we Single Cask Nation did one a couple years back, an 8-year-old in a Lafroig cask. And what's lovely about it is the Ardmore, the spirit character is so strong, it really shines through. But that Lafroig Lafroiginess just kind of lived on the edges of the Ardmore spirit. Do you find the same with this 10-year-old?
Yeah, absolutely. You still get that slight, more medicinal phenolic note to it.
Yeah.
As I say, I find Ardmore to be this is slightly, I say greener, that sounds weird, but it's that almost more vegetal smoke, more peppery smoke. Whereas Lafroig is medicinal. It's, burnt bandages and all that nonsense. And the 2009 seemed to ride somewhere between those two things. And that's a good place to be.
Yeah, very. There was a question that came in from Vlad earlier on, but I think this discussion he even said, oh, perfect segue into my question earlier. Does refusing to buy a parcel of whiskey affect your relationship? Has that been a thing for you?
I don't think so. I don't know. Probably wouldn't notice, to be fair. No, I mean, it's not like there's not home enough for all the whiskey in the world at the moment. That's for sure. And at the end of the day, you have to be quite strong that the deal has to be right for everybody, because otherwise you sit on stock for the rest of your life. Certainly from a broker point of view, I've never had that. I probably deal with some brokers more than others, and I work with some more than others, and that's probably true for everybody. And that's about relationships and who you get on with, how you work. But what I would say about the Scotch whisky industry, for all my negativity, which I sometimes feel at this point, I'm just beating down the industry. The thing that is amazing about it, and almost unthinkable in any other industry, is that every competing company works together. Like you will find that nowhere else, right? There is nowhere else where everybody chats, everywhere swaps, everyone's trading amongst themselves and then selling out, right? That's a very weird situation. And it is overall an incredibly friendly and supportive industry. We had some incredibly positive news about a project we have on Isla that I cannot share any more than the fact that it's incredibly positive, and I'll be sharing very positive news. And the nicest thing is the amount of messages you get internally from the industry. Like it's within about 20 minutes of something that's not publicly known, I've got 3 distillers sending me messages saying, what great news, from completely different companies.
Amazing.
And I genuinely don't think you'll get that anywhere else in the world. So no, I think people are pretty understanding, and everyone tends to be pretty open about what they're doing and what they're up to.
You don't think Pepsi called up Coke and said, great job on the new Coke, well done on the new recipe, guys?
Maybe
maybe they did.
I don't know if you saw I don't know if you got that over in the States. We had I think it was Burger King. Burger King did an advert for saying that you should buy from McDonald's in the UK during COVID. It was amazing. It was like, we would normally never say this, but during these hard times, you need to support your fast food places. Buy from Burger King and KFC. I mean, I buy from McDonald's and KFC. And I thought, wow, that's a turning point. That's the first time the rest of the world acts like Scotch whisky. I mean, I thought it was quite sad because it was fast food and I wanted to cry a little bit inside. But it's like, please don't encourage more of that. No. But Scotch whisky is always like that. Everyone's encouraging. Everyone gives you advice. So no, I don't think I've ever had a problem where I've said I can't do that deal and someone's taken the huff. That's just not. That's not the way it really works.
Yeah. We've got about 10 minutes left, and a bunch of questions are popping up here. And actually, this one from, and I'm going to apologize to this gentleman. I don't know how to pronounce your first name, so I'm going to do you a disservice and completely slaughter it and assume that your name is pronounced Anatoly Gelfer. Please don't hit me. This is kind of an interesting question that I think might go along the lines of what you were saying before about Bowmore and the 1993 Bowmore and how that vintage is different. So do you obviously are intimate with Bowmore and their inner workings from year to year. I can't think of anyone else that doesn't work for Bowmore that knows as much about Bowmore than you do.
Oh, I can.
I
know lots of.
Wow.
That's by the by.
But what do you think about this question here? Do you look for those interesting vintages, or is it just, hey, if I like it, I'm going to go with it?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
But probably we do it in reverse order. So I don't find out about distilleries workings and then go and find the distillate. So it's not, we don't have the same relationship as American whiskey, as bourbon with yeast in Scotch whiskey. It's a relatively new thing. It's an old thing and a new thing. So if you take yeast as a good example, and it is a great example because it's an active ingredient in the making of whiskey, right? It changes whiskey massively. But in 1970, I want to say 4, but it's probably either 2 or 6. UDV, United Distillers and Vintners, so Diageo created what is commonly known as distiller's yeast, right? And it's a strain of yeast that's massively efficient at turning sugar into alcohol. It can do it in about 48 hours. And I would also stress at this point, you will get a lot of people saying how bad that is. It's a wonderful thing, right? You can speed up process, you can make more liquid. Has to be used right. So most distillers for a period of time, used the same yeast strain because it was efficient and it did the same job. And in fact, I read an article who wrote that? I want to say Dave Broom, but it might have been someone else. Someone like that wrote an article recently saying exactly that. Most distilleries, actually, you know what? It was Becky's article because it was 2 days ago. I read it at the same time, and it was exactly when most distilleries use the same yeast, and that's true. Most distilleries in Scotland are using the same or similar yeast strains. It's something that's been expanded upon, particularly in the last few years, where people have started looking at how they change their yeast strains. So we don't have the same relationship with recipe that they have in bourbon as an industry. The recipe's simple: barley, yeast, water, done, right? Mm-hmm. And it's how you manipulate those things in the process that change the flavor profile.
Yeah.
That being said, if you take Bowmore as a good example, or Ben Nevis, both were running on, through the 90s at least, were running on old-fashioned brewers yeasts. Mm-hmm. So less efficient yeast strains. And that definitely makes a difference to your flavor profile. Bowmore changed in, I believe, 1999. And they didn't move to distiller's yeast exactly. They actually moved to 2 different styles of yeast. One is romantically described as a mopping up yeast, but basically something that actively creates fruity compounds, fruity flavors. So
got it. Yeah,
it's all about creating fruity flavors. Do those things change what I buy? No, not at all. They're really interesting. I find it fascinating why something tastes the way it does, but I buy it because it tastes how it does. And my example on that is always Lechek or Lagavulin. I would use those 2 every day of the week. So Lagavulin is a standard distiller's yeast, a peated malt. It's peated to about the same spec as Kalila. It's somewhere around the 37, 38 ppm. It changes up and down. It's a relatively short ferment. 50 to 60 hours. It's not massive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very kind of green and dank as a spirit. I mean, it's kind of moldy as a spirit. It's like, I mean, it doesn't mean as much to you, Joshua, but it's that bacon, frazzles. We always used to call it frazzles, but basically bacon, like it's dank meat, right? Slightly dirty meat that should probably make you ill. And it's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing. Lead check is even more extreme. It's literally 48 hours on the button. It's as quick as they can make it. There are no long ferments. There are none of the pretty stuff that all of the geeks go mad for. But my God, is that filth wonderful?
Wonderful. Yeah.
So I buy that because it tastes good. I don't buy it because it's made in the right way. I don't believe there's a right way. I don't believe that. I believe you make good spirit. What it does do, and to my point earlier about our good news, is those things then change how I look at production. So if I get to distill spirit, if Sukhinder and I get to distill spirit, then we will use everything we've learned to make the best spirit. We hope. But we also know there's an aspect of chance. There's only so much you can control, and you certainly do start fitting things into camps, like the heavier spirits, and you know where they come from. Like, Mortlach and Macallan and Glendronach, all those spirits, Glenfarclas, they're big, fat, sulfuric spirits, and they're fat and sulfuric because of these things. These things happen at those distilleries. These are the things that are in common. And if I wanted to make spirit, and I wanted to make it like that, I know I'd have to tick those boxes. Does that make sense? But I don't use that as a reason to buy something. The reason to buy something is really simple. Do I like the make? Does the vintage fit? Is it the right kind of, is it the right period of that distillery? What's the wood profile? And the wood profile is a funny thing because is it important? Absolutely. I can tell from looking at the wood profile how easy my job will be. That's it. So I look at it and go, yeah, my job's going to be a bit more difficult. I have to re-rack everything. But no, I don't look at things and think, oh, well, because it was made like that, I'll buy it.
Would you, and there's a couple more questions that came in, but this just popped into my head. Would you ever avoid a cask of whiskey because perhaps it's simply, while a very good whiskey, it doesn't fit what you think of as Glentockers, Imperial, Ardbeg, you name it, right? It doesn't match that distillery character that you're trying to put forward.
No, but I wouldn't bottle it as Single Malts of Scotland.
You do it under a different label.
Yeah.
Whiskey Trail or something like that. If it tasted
good, you'd find a way to bottle it. Yeah. And you'd explain that it is what it is.
Yeah.
A bottling we were talking about earlier that's not available in the US, sadly. We did a bottling of Islay single malt distilled in 1985 called Islay Violets, and it is what it is. It's got a big perfumey box and it tastes like perfume, right? And I can tell you every aspect of why that tastes the way it does. Like from a distillate point of view, I have done a lot of research to understand it. And from a personal point of view, I will not drink a bottle of it. I had the sample. I've been through it. I understand the whiskey. I can tell you its qualities. And it is a really great example. It's a perfect example of what it is.
There's a reason I have 3 bottles. I think it's a magnificent.
Yeah, but it's not something I want to drink particularly. But it's something I understand. Does it fit Single Malts of Scotland? You could argue it probably does. You could argue that it's a representative of the distillery at the time, because it's almost certainly Bemore. That doesn't say on the label. It's the most clearly Bamore thing I've ever tasted from 1985. But does it represent how I think of Bamore? And I guess this is where the ego comes in, right? This is the only bit that you all have to suffer. I'm really sorry, but at the end of the day, Single Malts of Scotland comes down to what me and Sukhinder think. And I think of Bamore being tropical fruit. I think of it being 93 and 96. I think it being 69 and 68 and on the good days 55. Oh God, 55. But that's where my head is at. It's not Palmer Violet.
Okay.
But that is part of the distillery history. And when you find something like that is representative of itself, that's wonderful in and of itself, like it is a perfect example of itself, then you still bottle it and you just find somewhere else for that to live. And so you should. I mean, you should share that with people. If you've got the opportunity, you should do it. It's almost a moral obligation. And on that, I'm going to drink some of this Ardbeg, which is a proper moral obligation.
This is perfect. Perfect for you because you have a bottle.
I even got one with Ardbeg written on the distillery, my friend. I mean, I've got the rarest bottle you'll ever find.
Does it have the?
Yeah.
Oh boy. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to pour something that I don't have your Ardbeg, but I will pour an Ardbeg just in honor of you. And let me see. We're going over time, but that's okay. We went over time last time. Some really good questions came in. Bill Myers had a few good questions that came in over the course of time, but Bill, I haven't been ignoring you. The conversation has just moved around a little bit, but this one, I liked this one. And I've been meaning to ask you this myself. How many distilleries? Because I know you've got a few thousand casks, right? I mean, so
we're taking a bit. So I remember starting when I first got the cask list in 2013, which felt very weird because it was a spreadsheet. I mean, technically, it's still just a spreadsheet. You'd love it if it's more technical. I remember Skinner saying to me, "I've got a lot of, I don't have a lot of width. I've got a lot of girth. I'm not sure, not necessarily about whiskey." And it was all what he was saying was that he had parcels of stuff from one distillery at a time, but we didn't have lots of different distilleries. And I have tried to change that. I mean, I guess, and it is a guess, I'd say we probably have make from 60, 70 odd distilleries. So probably about half the distilleries in Scotland, not all by any stretch. And there's always distilleries you forget. Like there's all these distilleries that you can't buy from. You can't get open. You can't. It's not possible. It's not physically possible. They don't make enough whiskey. Everyone in the US drinks it all. So, there's these distilleries you can't buy from. But we have a reasonable spread. The only thing nowadays is that the age range, and this is partly my responsibility. It used to be easy to buy old whiskey. To the degree that we thought it wasn't old, that was probably the other issue. I remember in my early days in 2013, 2014, I'd be discussing with Skinder about 1990 stock, and he'd be like, "Yeah, but do you have anything old? I want something old, like 60s or 70s, because it used to be easy to buy 60s whiskey, 70s whiskey." And of course, it seems ridiculous now when I look back at the parcels we turned down, because we were like, "Wow, it's not really old enough."
Amazing.
Of course, it would be 30 years old now, so it would be old enough now. But we were naive, and you learn from those mistakes, I hope. So I now have I'm probably weighted a little bit younger in preparation for the future. That's my hope. And then in terms of the oldest vintage, I mean, we still have old stock. We still have 60s stock sitting in wood. but that's where the range in single malts of Scotland kind of diverges. So well, everything that we have in the US at the moment is part of our kind of single cask range. We do have a range called Director's Special, and that's where Sukhinder takes a personal interest in everything. It's his whiskey, right? That's what he's looking after, he's bottling, he's caring for. Sure. It's not that I don't have any involvement in that. I will be looking at those casks and I'll be going, boss, you need to look at that, or but it's stuff he's particularly invested in, and a lot of that is the old stuff. So where we've bottled, we did a 40-year-old Glengoyne, which was mad 68 or something. Wow. We've got some. I'm trying to remember. We still got some. I think we still got a cask of not Glengarry. One of the other Glens.
Glengarry Royal.
No, oh God, I wish. I'd almost give away my son for that, but don't tell him I said it. But we have some special stuff.
Okay. There was two final questions that I wanted to put in front of you, and it's another one from Travis Williams, who's always good with the questions. Do you ever go back and look at a cask after a bottling to try to get a better understanding of the profile of the whiskey, the wood grain, the cask construction, etc.?
In terms of the physical, yes and no. Like, if we're able to be up at the bottling hall, which we haven't been able to this year, we will look out bits of wood. And quite often what we're doing is we're looking at the whiskey we're bottling, and then we're taking the wood and we're using it for something else, or we're deciding not to and we sell it on or whatever. Yeah. But in terms of the whiskey, so re-reviewing the whiskey, yes and no. I think that the thing that surprised me most, and what I learned most about single cask bottling, is the sample you get from the cask is not the thing you bottle, and it's a difference. Like, again, it's really easy to tell a story that you try a sample and you select it, and that's what you put in a bottle. And this is as close as you get to tasting whiskey straight out of a bottle. I'm afraid it's largely rubbish, because by the time you've dumped the cask and run it for a bottling line, you've attacked it with a lot of oxygen. It's been moved around a lot. So what you get in the bottle is different, almost always different to what you had in your cask sample. And largely, I think I said this at the beginning, largely it's better. Largely.
I'll agree with that. Yep.
So actually what I find is when we bottle a whiskey, yes, we go and we'll review the whiskey. Like, I'll open every single bottle. In normal times, so non-coronavirus times, I'll be in the office and we'll open every single bottle and try it in the office. And Andrew and I have a mini kind of Friday night session where we'll just be like plowing through bottle after bottle above and going, that one's amazing. Well, that's basically what we do. The nicer thing about that is the surprises, the moments of pure joy of finding something that's just really special. And we've had that relatively recently. We bottled a Craigellachie probably a year ago, which I did not show to Sukhinder. I should have done. It was our last cask of Craigellachie, and it was last cask from that vintage. And he bottled some years ago in single malts of Scotland, and they were good casks, nice whiskies. And this one was phenomenal. Like, the sample was great. Like, it was one of those samples where you didn't want to stop drinking. You just kept on going and going.
Yeah.
And I put it under single malts of Scotland because I was like, no one will notice. And Craigellachie, who cares? And all the rest. And then the bottle stock turned up, and we opened the bottle, and Andrew and I just kept looking at it, going, "This is unusually good." this is, special. This is a
Wow.
special, but this is the bottle you'll be going back to in 20 years' time and talking about.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And,
Okay.
I remember sending the samples off to Whiskey Fun and getting the mad review from Serge, and then getting the phone call later on, being like, "What's that about? Why do you bottle that? Why do you get that?" I was like, "Well, it must have been a mistake," To the same extent, Skinner kind of smiles and goes, "Well, you're doing the right thing because you found something good, you put it in a bottle and shared it with as many people as possible. It's gone around the world." So it's those whiskies that really excite me after the fact. It's those moments of pure joy. But in terms of how the cask was made up or built, or what was stock in it, I find it interesting, but I don't concentrate on it. We certainly don't look at every single cask after the fact. Maybe we should.
Okay, cool. Final question. And this one is from Chris Udy, who's been jabbing me this whole time and saying nice things about you, and par for the course here. But he had a very good question, and it's something that I wanted to ask you about anyway. Is there any distillery that you think is severely underrated unfairly and want to raise a public profile on, or are you just cellaring those bottles?
You know what? I don't hide stock, Chris. I'm sorry. I'm rubbish. I think anyone who's spent any time with me knows I've got a big mouth. So no, that's not one of my things. Glenbergie would be, I think it is underrated for what it is. It's special. I'd actually argue for a lot of Chivas makes that's true. Glentockers, Tormore. Tormore's phenomenal. I got some Tormore Spirit in the other day, and it was very, very young, or the wood wasn't great, but you could tell from the spirit it was glorious. It was just beautifully fruit-driven. A good whiskey. It's a wonderfully drinkable whiskey. I think Chivas as a company do a wonderful job of that. So yeah, those Tormore, Glentockers, Glenbergie would all be my kind of whiskies that people need to pick up. Milton Duff, again, I mean, it's a terrible name for the distillery, but Milton Duff, wow. But I think the distillery, and I said it earlier, the distillery that's really kind of that's really got me this year is Tobermory, and that's not from I found stock of it. I haven't. I bloody wish I had. We've been lucky enough to get some lead check, and I love lead check. And I know I'm not alone. Like there's a big light shined on that distillery. But trying Tobermory since they moved it to 46.3% or whatever, it's a different whiskey. It's a bigger whiskey, and it's phenomenal. It's phenomenally well made. So yeah, I don't know. I think so outside of the Chivas ones, it would probably be Tobermory. That'd be my distillery of interest. But every year it changes, and I think that's part of whiskey. Every year you find something else. That this year is quite exciting. Last year it was Deanston. Last year I tried 2 or 3 Deanstons that were really exciting. I bought a lot of Deanston this year because of that, rightly or wrongly. And the year before that it was Ben Nevis. And I realized we're now 3 or 4 years on, and everyone's like, "Well, Ben Nevis is amazing." Well, we couldn't get arrested selling. Whiskey Exchange couldn't sell 10-year-old Ben Nevis, and I was buying the 10-year-old tall round bottles, being like, "This is the most phenomenal liquid anyone's ever seen."
Phenomenal, yeah, yep.
And we got the 96. I remember getting the samples of 96 and 97 in, and it's one of those moments you pour the sample into the glass, you try it, and you go, "Oh, okay, and then you try the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one, and then I literally just walked straight out of my office into Sekinder's go, you've got to try this, and I'm just shoving 20 samples on his desk. He's like, which one? All of them. You've just got to try all of this. All of this is amazing.
Wow. Yeah.
And we went back and bought as much as we could. And I had a similar experience with Ben Nevis recently, because I bought some. I got the opportunity to try some 2015 and some 2013, and I only tried it in honesty. I tried it because I thought it would need re-racking, and I thought I'll check the spirit and see where the wood's at. And the 2013 sherry butts are among some of the most wonderful things I've ever tried. They're glorious, 6-7-year-old whiskey, and the 5-year-old barrels. I mean, it's electric, properly electric. It's just. There's a sweet over here called Skittles. You got Skittles? They're called something else. You definitely have them. They're called something else, but they're like hard on the outside.
Skittles. Yeah,
Skittles,
a rainbow of fruit flavors.
That's the one. Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah.
2015.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Taste like Skittles. Just insane. Yeah,
you've got me thirsty.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's not new. Like, everyone knows Ben Nevis is special, but it's when you try stuff that you don't think should be special.
I would argue that a lot of people are still discovering Ben Nevis, and it's folks like yourselves with Single Malts of Scotland and Cadden Heads, and all the independent bottlers who have been year over year bottling Ben Nevis. Now, granted, they're coming out with some of their own bottlings here and there. Not enough, I would argue. I think their make is some of the best around, and I would love to see it more. And it just makes me happy that there's a good amount of it available through independent bottlers. And when you told me about the parcel that you bought of this 5, 6, 7-year-old stock, I just got incredibly excited. Yeah. So, Ollie, thank you so much for staying up again until whatever the hell time is. It 3? It's 3 a.m. for you right now.
Yeah, more or less. I'm feeling pretty energized, so I think we'll just drink till 4. Right? That's what we did last time.
I think that's what we did last time.
Yeah.
But for the viewers, I almost said listeners, but for the viewers that are still with us. There is a second run of Single Malts of Scotland that have come to the U.S. And as we showed before, there's the 14-year-old Orkney. There is the 19-year-old Ardbeg. Oh, geez, I'm not going to go by memory. This is all terrible business here. The 10-year-old Ardmore. There's the Clynelish that we discussed, and then the 23-year-old Imperial. And I told you, Ollie. Single Malts of Scotland has been in my top 3 independent bottlers for a good long while, and for a reason. And it's obvious to me after having met you, and for the first time about 2 years ago, and then spending a lot of time, but arguably not enough time with you, that still our palates are very similar. And it really is for people who look for independently bottled whiskeys. When you bottle whiskey, you're bottling the stuff that you love. And so consumers, if they enjoy what you're bottling, that means that their palate is aligning with yours. And selling this stuff aside, being with ImpEx aside, Single Malts of Scotland, I think, holds the bar quite high for a lot of other independent bottlers to strive toward. Really phenomenal stuff. You should be proud, and I thank you for all of the whiskeys, the great whiskeys you've bottled that I was able to enjoy.
That's really lovely, Josh. But I guess the main thing for me is that that's our job is a relatively simple one. I always remember Mark Watt saying, like, you drink whiskey, you like whiskey, you bottle whiskey. That's your job, right? It's not a particularly complex task. My only hope is that we get to find like-minded people who like the same stuff as us. It's not. I'm never that fussed if someone hates something. I kind of think to myself, well, that's fine. We probably don't eat the same food. We're probably not sitting at the same table. You know, this is not, you know, we might have the same political thinking, but we probably don't enjoy the same flavors. All we can do is find whiskies that we think are really, really good. And I just feel massively privileged to work for a business run by a guy who basically says, yeah, do what you like, you know, and make sure you bottle what you love, and then you'll be fine. And two, to have partners like ImpEx and yourself, where I can enjoy that, we can share that. That's really heartening. The biggest struggle for me in 2020, and I have been incredibly fortunate during COVID, has been not being able to be in places with yourself and be in the States, all around the world, to be fair, but the US particularly, where I get to go and speak to people and explain what we do, why we do it, and then drink with people. Because at the end of the day, it's a drink. We do this for pleasure. It's bottled for pleasure. It's not bottled for collecting. It's not bottled for, it's just bottled to drink and have fun. So I really hope there are some bottles left in 2021, because my intention is to come and drink as many whiskies as humanly possible. It's a lot easier to expense stuff when it's my own brand. 1 gram of single malts of Scotland, and then some other stuff, like, then that makes sense. That all makes sense. And hopefully I'll get to meet lots of people and drink with them too, because that for me is the best part. That's the reason for doing it.
Well, when you come back to the very important market of Guilford, Connecticut, you can drink all the whiskey here, and we'll show you a good time. Looking forward to having you over here again.
Grand. Well, good night, everybody. Thank you very much for your time. I am now going to, I might go to sleep soon. Might go to sleep soon.
Well, thank you, Ollie. Again, I appreciate it. I'm sorry this is not only our second, but our last live session together, at least for 2020.
Well, yeah, I'm doing another session in the US, 11th, 13th. It's a much more reasonable time, Josh. I'm not going to lie to you. You've let me down. Like, it's 10 o'clock at night for me. It's I'll be drinking beer and whiskey at that point, and it's going to be great. I want to say 11th or 13th of December. But yeah, this is my penultimate tasting of the year, so it's been pretty good.
Well, I was happy to be a part of it. Thank you. All right, so I'll take you off the screen here, and then I just want to communicate something to everybody. Again, Ollie, thank you so much. So for those of you that are still on watching, we have 2 final ImpEx distillery deep dive sessions to go. The next one coming up is on December 9, and that's going to be with Chris Udy, and we'll be talking about Japanese single malt, Japanese pure malt, and Japanese blended whiskeys, and that's through the lens of Matsui Distillery single malt, Kuroyoshi, which is the pure malt brand, and then Totori, which is Japanese blends. And then finally, on Wednesday, December 16, I will have Jason Johnston Yellen, who is my business partner in Single Cask Nation. And I'm going to try to figure out some way to interview him as if I'm not part of the company. That's going to be it's going to be fun. We'll see. Let's see if I can make it happen. Everybody who's watched this today and who has watched this series over the weeks, thank you so much. It really means a lot that you're spending time with us, that you're learning from us, learning with us, and enjoying some good drink along the way, and hopefully finding some new favorite bottlings for your holiday celebrations. So cheers to you all, and we will see you 1 week from today.